Hello and welcome to Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses and I am your host today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have a wonderful discussion today here about nutrition here in January. A lot of you during January really look at our nutrition. We look at our nutrition, we look at our weight, we see how it's affecting us. And I think we've all heard the old adage, we are what we eat. Now, when we think about that, we a lot of times think about how physically we feel, but we don't necessarily think about how is what we eat affecting our mental health and maybe even our stress. Well, we have a wonderful guest today. His name is Dr. Johnny Figueroa. He has been here at Loma Linda for 6 years as a professor, and he also did his postdoc here. So he is part of the family. Like I said, has been here for 6 years, and he is an associate professor of basic sciences here at Loma Linda University. So I want to welcome Dr. Figueroa here, and also say if you are watching us live, please go ahead and use the comments section to type in questions if you want to ask Dr. Figueroa anything about his presentation and this topic today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Johnny Figueroa.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen right now. There we go. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share my research with you, Dr. Moses, and your audience in life wellness. And it's a topic that it's a particular, topic that is very interesting to me. And I know that it might be to some of you related to how stress and unhealthy eating behaviors are related. I would like to start by providing a disclosure that I don't have any relevant financial or non-financial relationships related to this presentation. And also that the topics that I'm going to illustrate and present today, please discuss them with your provider or primary physician. The learning outcomes for today's lecture or class is to understand new aspects of that relationship between poor dietary practices and psychosocial stress, and also how we are using animal models to understand and improve obesity and mental health outcomes. So those are the two main key points that I would love for you to take home today. I am a nutritional neuroscientist by training, and for a very, very, very long time, I've been fascinated by the power of nutrition to influence health. I'm interested particularly in how eating practices influence stress and how stress influences what we eat. So it's that interplay, that interaction that occurs between what we eat and how that affects stress. We all know at some level, that we're all familiar with the idea that exposure to stress influences feeding behaviors. You've probably heard about stress feeding or emotional eating, but what is actually the relationship between those two? And since the early 50s, there's been a lot of studies showing that relationship in humans, also in animal models, showing that when we are stressed, we tend to eat, but that relationship is not always linear, meaning that if we are stressed very severely, normally we tend not to eat. But when the stress is chronic, that's when usually we start having problems in overeating or having that, as we know better, stress eating. There's a lot of studies, again, that in this field, and one of the main proponents of that interplay is Dr. Mark Potenza. But I really encourage you to read about his work, specifically his work in 2014, showing a very, very specific review on how that interplay occurs between stress and eating behaviors. I will argue that understanding that relationship between stress and eating behaviors has never been more important. The last year or so has seen a significant shift in the perceived stress and food intake all around the world. Nowadays, there are over 1,000, and I checked that last night, there's over 1,000 studies which have reported an association between COVID-19 related lockdowns and policies, and how that has altered eating behaviors all around the world, including emotional overeating. And here you can see several studies pointing out that interplay and how that interplay is affecting how we associate with food. Here's a study done in young adults in Germany, and it's showing that a large group of people, in this case, 31% of the study population, increased their feeding behaviors, or the amount of food that they were having increased during lockdown. But notice also that was not only about introducing foods to their diet, but the type of diet that they also took was very, very different. If you see here, one of the main components of that new additional nutrition was coming from confectionaries like cakes, tarts, donuts, cookies, but also you see that they introduce more breads, more meat in their diets for those that increase their dietary intake. Not everyone increase their dietary intake. Some of them decrease their intake, but it shows that these main groups, these carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, and also saturated fats were taking on the lead in terms of dietary composition and content. We also have seen in the last 2 years, that these practices are not only affecting parents, but are also affecting kids. And there are studies showing that this is reflected now in terms of high prevalence in obesity rates. Specifically, in California, this is a study done in Southern California by Kaiser Permanente, and it shows clearly that in adolescents and children, there's an increase of over 9% in body mass index, reflecting in higher rates of obesity in this population. We know also that obesity rates are not equally distributed in different racial and ethnic groups. And specifically, there's a disparity, a disproportionate burden of obesity in minority populations. Here in Southern California, specifically in our county of San Bernardino, before the pandemic, we had rates as high as 45, 46% in some of the cities in San Bernardino. And now with the pandemic, we're expecting that these rates will go all the way to 50, 55% obesity rates in our area, resulting in a very high prevalence in this region. In my laboratory, again, we're interested in that relationship between poor diet quality and stress, not always coming from the poor diet quality to stress, but also how the way we perceive stress can lead to our preference for high fatty foods, for high sugar diets that will basically self-medicate ourselves. And that has been a relationship that has been established, again, for many, many decades. We are interested specifically in what are the mechanisms. How is this actually happening in the brain? And to do that, to address that question and to identify potential curative interventions that can help patients, we need a better understanding of what are the factors that affect the brain and behavior. Specifically, what are those factors that create that causal association between stress and eating behaviors that are not healthy. And to do that, we use an animal model. We have used rats for many years now to understand specifically that causal relationship. In humans, it will be a little bit more complicated to understand that association, specifically as it pertains to the mechanisms. But similar to humans, in rats enjoy fatty foods. They do enjoy sugary foods as well. And they have a similar behavioral response to stress. That release of glucocorticoids, release of epinephrine, in that acute phase of stress is very similar to what happens in humans. And rats also exhibit that, as well as the brain circuits that mediate all these feeding behaviors. So rats are a really, really good tool, a really good model to allow us to understand what is that specific association and whether it's a causal effect between the stress and altered feeding behaviors. In our lab, we have taken an integrative view of how behavior, anatomy, and mechanisms are all contributing to this effect of stress. So we analyze how the animals behave, using tools that are very similar to what's used in humans. We also analyze the anatomy of the brain, how the brain changes with these exposures. And we use similar tools that are used in humans, such as the magnetic resonance imaging. We evaluate how those circuits are formed specifically during adolescence, and we evaluate also mechanisms. What are the specific genes, the specific molecules that are affected in those specific circuits, and how we can then feed them back to the behavioral aspect, and understand a fully grasp of the biology behind mental health and obesity. So I would like to start sharing with you a few of the findings from my laboratory. And these are really, really recent findings. How psychosocial stress, specifically very early during adulthood, when the rats are just passing their adolescent period, how those changes in psychosocial stress can alter how the animals relate to food. One of the things that we found, which is really remarkable, and here you see 4 different groups. Most of the studies we've done are with 4 different groups. Rats that are unexposed, rats that are exposed to stress. We provide them, predatory stress, and rats that are consuming or have access to a controlled diet, and rats that have access to a Western diet. And by Western diet, I mean a diet that is very, very rich in saturated fats and simple carbohydrates. So by providing these animals, with that exposure to stress, and also by access to the high-fat diets, we found that these rats are consuming a lot when they're exposed to stress. And this is the percent change in caloric intake. So these rats are consuming more calories. They're not being able to regulate that caloric intake, and they're actually, when they're exposed to stress, consuming more calories. They're also gaining more weight. And as we see here, if you compare the controls in this bar graph, a black bar graph, if you compare that control with animals that were exposed and also received exposure to stress, we see that there is a significant increase in the amount of body weight gain in these animals. Again, this is very similar to what happens in humans, and we were really thrilled and excited to find that these changes that are observed in a human population are also reflected in rodents. We decided to investigate the anatomy, how the brain circuits that are related to feeding are affected by stress, this psychosocial stress during early adulthood. And what we found is that stress, and here we're comparing like different areas of the brain and also observing at different vectors, different characteristics of the brain structure, we found that centers associated with feeding behaviors, specifically the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus that mediates feeding behaviors, these regions were affected by psychosocial stress. Again, suggesting that these changes in behavior may be a manifestation of those changes that were galvanized by the psychosocial stress. But what about that interplay between poor diet quality and stress reactivity? When I joined the lab, and I established my research program, I was very interested in how this poor diet quality can affect how we respond to stress. It's the other aspect of this vicious cycle that I'm interested in understanding. And one of the things that we describe in the literature is that the consumption of these high saturated fat diets can impact how the emotional brain is connected. That wiring of the emotional brain between the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, shown here in the control diet, if we compare that with what happens in a Western diet-fed animal, you see that there is a disruption in that integrity and the structure of these fibers that connect that specific circuitry that is implicated in emotional reactivity and stress reactivity. We also found that these animals showed some signs of anxiety and depressive-like behaviors in some of the tasks that we exposed them to, showing again that poor diet quality was affecting how the brain was wired and how the animals responded to stress. So right now, I'll take some questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Figueroa. That was extremely Interesting. We actually have some questions coming in, so I'm just going to go right to the questions. So,
Good.
one of the questions is, what foods can reduce the impact of stress on the brain and mental health?
Fantastic question, and I will allude that to the at the end of the presentation. But one of the top nutrients that the brain employs or uses is fatty acids. The brain metabolism is really active. We use a lot of our energy in our brain, and fatty acids are key. Omega-3 fatty acids in particular, nuts are enriched in fatty acids, these omega-3 fatty acids, and also antioxidants. As I will show you at the end of the presentation, the consumption of fruits high in antioxidants are shown to be protective to the brain, and it's really remarkable the effects that we have seen in some of our models showing that these nutrients are protective for animals in terms of their stress response.
Oh, well, I can't wait to get to that part of your presentation. We have another question here. Why has stress eating become prevalent during the corona pandemic?
That is also a good question. And it's been more associated, at least in humans, with the chronic aspect of the pandemic. Since it's a slow stressor, we have it there. Like I mentioned before, if we were exposed to an acute stress, usually what will happen is that we'll tend not to eat. But when we are exposed to these chronic stressors, that are continuous, that high inflammation or inflammatory aspect, and also some cognitive aspects of the brain will allow us or lead us, to consume these high sugar, high fat diets that will, again, self-medicate ourselves for us to feel a little bit better. I think it's the chronic aspect of this unpredictability of we don't know what's going to happen. So, we might as well, feel good for 5-10 minutes, having baked something.
It's interesting. I think we are not even close to figuring out how this pandemic has actually affected us in many, many ways, especially mental health. And this actually comes to it. We have another question here saying, people have 24/7 access to their kitchens now. I work from home. How does space impact eating? I will say that if if I wasn't quarantining with my husband, I would have eaten a lot more just because, the idea of having someone to talk to and interact with is helpful for this. But I understand the
Definitely.
24/7 piece of this.
Absolutely. As I will show you at the end of the presentation, one of the things that we've learned from our rat model, and we know in humans as well, is that social support is critical, for buffering stress, and that connection with family and friends and our bubble, it's really, really protective in terms of the impact of stress in the brain and also in these behaviors associated with eating.
So why don't we get to the second half of your presentation?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Let's
And thank you all for your questions.
Okay, so there are some fundamental questions that we have as a laboratory that we have started to address, and I encourage you, if you guys are interested in our research, to go into the literature or send me an email. I'll be happy to share some of these findings with you. One of the things that we want to understand is whether these effects of stress and diet are reversible. Can we reverse those and restore those circuits that are affected? We also want to understand whether there are specific stages of our lives that are more susceptible to the effects of stress and nutrition. And we have found that adolescence seems to be a very, very critical stage of development, as well as, wanting to understand whether female animals or female rats are more susceptible to the consequences of stress. Another question that we have that is very, very important right now in the laboratory is to understand specifically what are the genes that are associated with these responses and how we can use that information and translate that into human populations. As it pertains to female animals, we did a study very recently, Perla Ontiveros Angel, she performed a study showing that female rats seem to be more susceptible to psychosocial stress-induced binge eating. So these animals are exposed to stress, and after that, they're exposed to a high-fat diet, intermittent high-fat diet. And we found that these animals consume a lot more than other animals, male animals, in this case, counterparts that were also exposed to stress, almost double the amount when we compare that to their body weight. Again, showing that there are specific vulnerabilities implicated with stress and psychosocial stress, at least in our model of stress. Another important characteristic that we are looking at is how nutrition and stress can not only influence the adolescent brain, but also how these changes can be perpetuated across generations using epigenetic tools and epigenetic techniques. And maybe the next time we have a chat like this in Wellness Live, I can introduce you to the concept of epigenetics and how these changes can alter, not only intergenerational, but also transgenerational, and how that inheritance of stress can impact our feeding behaviors, across generations. That's a very important topic of research right now in our laboratory. So in summary, what I wanted to present today, again, is that interplay between poor diet quality and psychosocial stress, how those aspects are altered and affected. And our model has been always based on a model that was established in 1997, modeled by Eager and Swinburne, in which they presented an ecological model of obesity. We parted from that model, showing that the environment, specifically psychosocial stress and obesogenic diet, can influence brain structure, specifically that structure associated with feeding and eating. So if you are exposed to these environmental factors, this affects how the brain connections are made, specifically between the hippocampus and the hypothalamic nuclei associated with feeding. And we also know that if we have changes in that structure, that can lead to changes also in behavior. And these alterations in behavior are manifested in anxiety and emotional overeating. We now know that if you combine all these factors, that can lead to obesity. Not only in animals, but also in humans. If you have this obesogenic environment, brain changes associated with also behavior, then can lead to increases in body mass index and obesity and inflammation. And these changes, as we have shown in other studies, obesity by itself can affect the brain, the same circuits, and can affect how we relate to our environment. We're more susceptible to stress, we like more obesogenic diets, and this cycle continues to perpetuate and affecting health, not only physical health, but mental health. So what are the factors that we have found that moderate that impact of stress, specifically in the adolescent brain? In the adolescent brain, we know that a balanced diet seems to be critical for brain plasticity and promotes resilience, specifically the omega-3 fatty acids that I mentioned, and any anti-inflammatory food, specifically legumes and also fruits that are rich in antioxidants that seem to be protective for the brain when it's undergoing stress. Also, we have seen that social support is critical. We did a study in which we showed that social instability, that model of psychosocial stress, even in a rat model, makes the animals more susceptible and vulnerable to stress. So providing a social support, I think it's key for this pandemic that we're living in, and protective in terms of providing resilience and tools for resilience. Other aspects that we haven't tested in animals, but we know that are protective based on the literature, are meditation and exercise, which we hope, at least the exercise aspect, we hope to incorporate in our models in the future. So I would like to thank first the stellar group that I have from the Center for Health Disparities, and for providing the platform to bring this quality of great students that have produced this work, from ABC students, UTP, undergraduate, high school students, and also medical students that have helped me develop these ideas and these concepts. I also want to thank all the funding agencies that have provided support for this research. And if you want to find out more about what we're doing and how we're doing it, you guys are welcome to use your phones and the QR code to find out more about these, media outlets. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Moses and the Wellness Live team for this invitation to share a little bit of our research. And I'm happy to take some questions now.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Figueroa. We do have some questions coming in, so why don't we just get right to it? So we have a question that says, is it possible to revert oxidative stress damage through dietary intervention?
That's a great question, and the answer is an absolute yes. There are different dietary interventions that have been shown to reduce the oxidant capacity and are highly antioxidant. Specifically, like I mentioned before, a high consumption of omega-3 fatty acids seems to be protective, and also diets that are enriched in antioxidants. We published a study 2 years ago showing that animals that are exposed to this model of stress, the oxidative stress increases dramatically in these animals. Providing an anti-inflammatory diet, even the ketogenic diet, has shown in animal studies to be protective for the impact of stress particularly. So Mediterranean diets, ketogenic diets, in moderation, can be helpful, at least to help us cope with stress.
That's great. We have another informational question that says, how can a rat model help address obesity and anxiety disorders?
That is a very, very good question. Thank you for that. So we have used an animal model to be able to grasp what are the specific genes and specific molecules that are affected by specifically stress, psychosocial stress, and diet. In a human population, that will be really complicated to evaluate specifically or pinpoint specifically which is the factor that is contributing or creating that causality and that causal effect. And going back to the model that I presented, and the topic of this lecture, we know that stress can lead to changes in eating behaviors. So there's a causality there based on what we have shown, but there's also an effect. So when I ask cause and effect, it's both, and there's a bidirectional connection between those two factors. The stress can lead to these changes in eating behaviors, but also when we start eating bad, that affects how we react to stress. And it goes both ways. So it's a cause and it's also an effect, and it's also bidirectional in terms of that specific association between those factors.
Okay, great. We have another question here is, what is next for you and your research program? How can you expand on this research and apply it to humans?
Great. So one of the goals that we have as of now, and we're actually working on an application, a grant application to request funds to run at an experiment, in humans. What we would like to validate is that the genes that we have identified in our model can also be predictive, in a human population. So one of the goals that we have right now is to take on, a community project, a public health project, to evaluate in adolescents, and specifically how these dietary practices can affect brain circuitry, and how that brain alterations in brain circuitry and also specific genotypes can predict whether these individuals in a longitudinal study will develop obesity or mental health disorders. So that's one of the things that we are working on right now, recruiting a large group of collaborators from UCI, UCLA, and also Department of Public Health.
So we have time for one last question here, and thank you, Nancy, Jill, for you're getting responses of how wonderful the presentation was. This one is from Ricardo. Are the relations between unhealthy eating and stress hypothetically heightened in the case of mental disorders such as OCD and GAD?
That's a good question. Thank you, Ricardo. And the answer is yes. It has been shown in the literature that this heightened emotionality or emotional reactivity has been linked to overconsumption of foods, specifically, these fatty foods, and it's been shown in different mental disorders, but specifically those that in which the emotional components are affected or emotional reactivity is affected, those disorders can lead to overconsumption of food. So the answer is a definite yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Figueroa, for your time today. This has been hugely helpful. In
Thank you.
summary, let's see if I get it. So number one, food does affect our mind. And it can affect it in a very profound way. And our diet can actually be protective. And what we can do is we can start eating anti-inflammatory diets, as you mentioned, berries, fruits, vegetables, these types of things. And if you have not eaten a healthy diet for many years, you can start today. It's never too late because we can reverse some of these things from what you're saying. So is that a good summary of what
that
we
is
went over?
That is a great summary. Just be mindful, that we are under stress and that can lead to us selecting foods that are not too appropriate. So be more mindful about how we select those foods and what is the potential impact of the foods that we eat on how we react to stress.
Perfect. Well, I think that's encouraging to all of us because we can start today. We can start eating better today. And I think we're in the middle of, kind of a surge right now. We don't know how stress is affecting us. And if there's anything that we can do, it's good to be proactive, and we can start with our food.
That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Figueroa. Again, thank you for watching us, and please join us again next month for our next Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and we'll see you next time.